Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to the Cage Rage podcast. Your host, Chadillac, and my guest and fight analyst, Miguel Iturrate. Miguel, how are you doing today?
Good, Chad. Thanks for having me.
Glad to be back. Today we're talking Bellator. So Bellator's made some new moves. They're doing some great stuff. They're coming off a really successful last couple of shows, actually. So we decided we should probably cover what's going on with them and sort of give the fans what they've been asking for, because we've had a lot of questions on email about, hey, what do you think of Bellator? They've got a lot of stars that sort of float around the edges, and you put those same guys in the UFC, and who does what? What do they look like? So let's start out with this. Miguel, you're the fight analyst here. You're the expert in it. Take the audience through a real quick idea on the roster of Bellator, save for the legends. We'll keep that for later. Of the actual Bellator young fighters, the studs that are up and coming and that are in the rankings right now, who goes to the UFC and has a real competitive shot in top 10 fights, feather through heavy?
Well, here's the thing, is when you look at the UFC, has 700 fighters on the roster. I'm not sure what Bellator has, but Bellator's got to have a couple of hundred at least.
Yeah.
Around the weight classes and things like that. They maybe have 200, 300, 400, something like that. But whatever it is, start from there, and you're already starting with them being second to the UFC. And that has to do in terms of talent and things like that. It also has to do in terms of the way people chart their careers, right? Because I think, whether you like it or not, and as good as Bellator has been doing and things like that, I don't know that there are many 12-year-old kids saying, I want to be a Bellator fighter. I think you got Rory McDonald's and people like that who, since kids, wanted to be a UFC fighter. And I think the UFC has that trump card over Bellator and always will. It's going to take Bellator maybe an altered strategy if they're really going to work on that aspect of it, because they're not really doing it. They don't really have that. So what's the other issue? The other issue is more than the UFC. Bellator relies on gimmicky things. Especially at the top of their cards to sell their cards, and they're kind of shameless about it, and that they put older fighters at the top of the marquee and stuff like that for name recognition and things like that. I don't know that stuff does them any real good, but what it also takes away from, and the UFC also gets accused of this, is that it's not a sport. At the end of the day, if you're looking at this like a sport, everybody's worried about the rankings and a fight that happened over there with this ranking guy, and he moved up, and this guy, moved from 19 to 20 because of a loss, and how those things get done at some point, I don't know. The boxing commissions all have rankings and things, but those are all broken and based on who pays sanctioning fees. But the UFCs are messed up because, they can put Conor McGregor as the number one contender because the guy sells tickets. Whereas, what about Ferguson? What about the other guys? They don't legitimately have to answer those questions. So more than the UFC, Bellator is less of a sport. And I don't know if less of a sport wraps all that up, but they are less of a sport. They have more gimmicks, less of a sport. So if you're in that league as just a fighter, I think you're kind of still in an unrecognized mode.
I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's fair
to
call. I don't think that's fair to say that Bellator is less of a sport because they have to do what they have to do. I mean, look, they're sort of drowning on dry land. They started from behind. They're the underdog from Jump Street, as is anyone who comes into MMA and wants to make a stamp. They're doing the best that they can with what they've been given. They were dealt a shitty hand from the start because the UFC has a monopoly on the game, and that's just kind of the way it is. You don't hear people say that about. And I'm kind of getting out of my league here because I don't know anything about professional wrestling necessarily, but the NWA versus the WWE, I don't even know if that's a real thing anymore. But to say that they're not a wrestling league, but the WWE is, because they have to rely on a different gimmick, so they have to break. They have to staple each other and things like that, like we saw in the movie The Wrestler. Whereas maybe the WWE, they don't allow them to break the bulbs over each other's heads. It's gimmicky. It's gimmicky. I understand that, but regardless, I don't agree with that, and I think that's unfair to say. But nonetheless, you skirted around the question. So let's get back to the question at hand. If you put Bellator guys in with UFC guys, who survives and who drowns right away?
I think it all depends. Keep in mind, some of the guys at Bellator are very talented. Some of them are very good, and especially Bellator does have an occasional guy that they brought along from the very beginning and that they can call their fighter who's done very well. Michael Koroshoff, is one. Douglas Lima is another, where their major careers have been fought with Bellator, and they're good fighters. I think they do well in the welterweight class. We'll see. Now with Rory McDonald over there, you get a good measure for. He's got their belt at 170. I think you get a good measure of where the UFC guys will stack up. At the end of the day, McDonald was labeled a prodigy of some type and a future champion with the UFC, and he never really broke through to get the belt. So you can consider that he never was a UFC champion, and he came in and grabbed the Bellator belt. Going in the other direction, I guess the best example is our guy Eddie Alvarez. And the bottom line is you have to survive the UFC's matchmaking. They didn't do him any favors.
None.
Matchmaking guys that they did at the very beginning, because they put him in right at the front line. Now Eddie obviously, I think, wanted to be paid like a frontline guy, so you got to do frontline fights. So I'm not saying it's a mix-up, but when you're trying to measure guys, let the guy get his feet wet a little bit in the format, the UFC, the guys in the back, get to a comfort level. You don't put him with Donald Cerrone the first fight out. That could be a super fight. You know what I mean? But I'm okay with that. But it's hard to measure. Alvarez, at the end of the day, did grab a UFC belt before losing it to McGregor. So Alvarez is a guy that acquitted Bellator quite well. Alvarez probably has a resume that goes beyond just Bellator, but he was a firm example of Bellator guy. They made some weird decisions, like, if we're looking for talent outside of the UFC, Bellator's got most of the other talent, and there's some regional shows and things like that. But what I'm talking about it not being less of a sport is that they rely less on nurturing fighters and bringing them along. They have their guys who are on the undercard, who still be on the undercard, who are not going to be main event fighters.
Sure.
And they don't people along in the same way. They don't have the same kind of competition that the UFC does. When they bring up with the TV show, and then the guy comes to the Kelvin Gastelum, for example, watched his career come from the TV show into the UFC rankings and things like that. And now, he's on the cusp of perhaps a title fight, or he may just be coming off of one. But the point is with Gastelum, there's a guy that there was the time where he was with the TV show, a time where he was coming up as a contender, a few breakthrough fights. Now he's considered a contender. He had some weight class issues, so he got delayed and stuff. But that bringing along of a fighter, that seems to happen less in Bellator. You either come there and have a star established, or maybe you rank, even their champions that they brought along, like Koroshoff and some of those dudes, they don't main event with those guys. The UFC will main event Demetrius Johnson, even though they know this sucks and we're going to have 100,000 pay-per-view sales. We'll do it because he's our champion. They present their guys a certain way. They put geriatric main events over their champions, and all the advertising is on the geriatric main events. Yep. So I think they're leaning less on the sports fan and more on the fan that has the gimmick.
Okay, to get back to the specifics of my question, here's three: Venom Page, pick one, the Pitbull Brothers, and Paul Daly. What do they look like in the UFC in the top 10?
Okay, Bellator, hopefully they get to do Page and Daly. I think that's an interesting fight. It's an all-British fight, and I think there's nothing wrong with targeting that market. I think the Brits back their fight fans. I think that. What was that?
It sells.
Yep. And I think the Brits back their fighters up. I think the Brits are boxing at heart, but I think that MMA could steer a few fans their way, and they're already moving the needle. And that translates into more fighters and stuff at the end. You got Bisping as the first UFC champion from England. You got Ian Freeman as the first UFC fighter from England. But I don't know that the roster is full of as many British fighters as you could have. I think you could have an independent UFC England operating almost, at a lower level, bringing guys to the top, but operating a UFC England operating with 12 or 15 shows a year with just the British scene. So I don't know if that might be the future. So in Venom Page, I think you got a little bit of what's coming next. And with Daly, you still got a guy who's a little bit more old school. Venom Page could do well in the UFC. He could also get housed. What's the name of the kid that he actually reminds me a little bit of a UFC fighter at times. He's better, but give me a moment and let me find it. And again, this UFC kid, he came up through the ranks of the TV show. And, let me just go to rankings here. And he may not even be in the top 10 anymore.
The Bellator famously came in and took a lot of the tough guys, the tough series kids out of there and signed them right away. When the UFC cut them, when they realized that the series kind of wasn't going anywhere, and a lot of those guys just weren't going to pan out and come to fruition as real fighters, which is kind of a no-brainer. I mean, we all saw that coming. Jesus Christ, some of the guys they picked just wow. I mean, some of those guys were just shark bait from Jump Street, and they put a lot of busters on that show that I couldn't believe they did it. It didn't make much sense to me.
All right. In many ways, Michael Page reminds me a little bit of Uriah Hall, if you remember his UFC career, where he came up with a lot of knockouts and stuff. Was kind of an exciting striker. And I think Page is better than Hall, but Hall is a guy that had his moment with the UFC and then he kind of leveled off. I think obviously he's still on the roster and stuff, but at this point he's lost more than he's won. But he's a guy with a flashy set of skills that you can market, and you got to see at some point when you do have real competition, it's like, what are you going to put him in against? Always strikers, then he's going to look great. But if you're actually going to say, all right, let's see how he does against a grinding wrestler, then you might get Venom Page ground and beat up. How would Venom Page do with somebody like Nurmagomedov style? You know what I mean? So it becomes a situation there. Paul Daly, I think, has already had UFC fights and stuff. And again, with him, you have an older fighter that is known for what he does, which is his hands and stuff, and he's got some other limitations. I think he would know how to manage a UFC fight, but I don't think you're looking at a contender. I think with Page, you're looking at a guy who could be a contender, but I think you still have open questions about whether he's got holes in his game that other guys are going to be able to exploit. And who's the other guy that you wanted to ask about?
I don't even remember.
You said
the Pitbull brothers. Just pick one.
Oh, okay.
I already know the answer.
Here's another good. We can talk about both of them. One's better than the other, right? But
yeah.
They're both pretty fighters, and they're both staples in Bellator, right?
Yeah.
And I think Bellator did the right thing by that. Hopefully they banked some money, because I think that they gave Bellator a nice level at the weight classes they are. These guys were like doormen, and they keep a nice level, so I think they can hang very well in the UFC. I think the better of the two brothers, and they're both named Patrick, so I'm not going to get into dividing up, but the better of the two, who's held the Bellator belt more extensively, if they both held them, but there's one who's a little bit better by resume than the other. I think he could maybe be a UFC contender. On the right day, maybe he could have gotten the championship. At the end of the day, what you would be talking about there would have been him fighting someone like Jose Aldo or McGregor, right? But if forget McGregor, but Jose Aldo, who were the champions in those weight classes? Renan Barão. He would have had all Brazilian stuff. That's why the UFC didn't, probably wouldn't want to bring them along. And I don't know that they're quite that good. I don't know that they're on Jose Aldo's level good, So maybe they qualify as contenders in the UFC. But I think, the guys who could go to the UFC and win a belt, I think are few and far between.
I'm really surprised to hear you say that about the Pitbull, Patrici and Patricio, or Patricio, Patricio and Patricio, or whatever it is. I'm really surprised to hear you say that about them. I've never put them in high regard as far as being. I mean, I think they're tough guys, but I think in the UFC they're busters. And I don't think they're much. No, and I don't mean any disrespect to them for the Bellator guys and for them, in person. I'm sure they're great guys. I know they work hard, but look, the bottom line is we're talking fights here, and we're talking about who makes it and who doesn't, and. That's a hard thing for fighters to accept and to swallow. When you have to look a fighter in the eyes and tell them, as promoters and matchmakers, we've had to do that over and over again for 20 years. A fighter comes to you and says, okay, well, who am I going to, who are you going to put me up against next? And, can you get me another fight? And you kind of got to look at him and go, you're really not somebody I can use again, or, and they go, oh, let me fight this guy. And you go, well, look, you're not really the guy I can use for that. Maybe I can get you in to fight this guy. And they go, well, what's in that for me? And you go, well, what's in it for me as a promoter is the problem. And you don't have a lot to offer the promoter. And I don't see you as being the kind of guy that's going to be able to gain the ladder. And that's a hard thing to break to a kid who's 22 years old. He spent the last 4 years of his life in the gym grinding, and he's got UFC posters on the wall, and he buys every pay-per-view, and he watches Fight Night, and he does all that stuff. Man, that's a hard thing to break to people. But in my experience, I've found that honesty makes you an asshole, but at least it makes you an honest asshole. And that's just the way it is. So for whatever that's worth.
No, you can't make a mistake in matchmaking. Just about it. But put it this way: the Ferrer brothers. I recognize what you're trying to point out, and that they're just pedigree, overall lesser quality than the UFC guys. And I kind of summed it up by saying. They're not Jose Aldo level guys, right? So they operate somewhere beneath that. Are they Dos Anjos level guys? Probably not even that, right? Dos Anjos, I think, is an excellent fighter.
Absolutely.
Rafael Asuncion. The UFC's got some Brazilians on the roster that are out. I don't know if these kids beat any of those guys, right? And that's the deepness of the UFC's roster, and that's where the matchmaking comes in. If you come in and you take them and you put them in against those guys right away, they're going to start, they're going to have records that look like 1 and 2 in the UFC. And I think that's at the end of the day what the UFC likes to see, and when they bring a Bellator guy in for the draft.
Absolutely.
I think they're pretty good fighters, though. And that's what I want to do is not disrespect them. At the end of the day, they're professional guys that have been at the top of the Bellator roster for a decade now, really, And in that type of situation, like I said, hopefully they bank money. They probably would have made less money on the UFC roster and had different records and maybe have a different position. That's part of what we're talking about with Bellator being more gimmicky and less able to get their top guys competition is another problem, right?
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
There's all kinds of things. And then what you were talking about, too, to me, matchmakers have a way of doing it. You have to, if you have a guy and the expectations on his end are not what you're seeing, and you've got, talent assessment is something that you care about. The promoters want to make a buck, and I understand that, but that's where matchmaking and commissions are supposed to be taking care of people for the matchmaking aspect of it. You can prove it to them in the ring. I can tell you a story. I had an 8-man tournament that we had some money that we were throwing an 8-man tournament down here in Costa Rica in the MMA, and I got to invite guys from Mexico, from Argentina, from all over Latin America, and it was a very, very good tournament. The guys from Costa Rica were very good at 155 pounds. The Argentinian guy was rough as hell. The Chilean kid was small, but he actually won the fucking thing. So it was a good tournament. And one of the kids that showed up was a kid from Colombia. And he walked in, and I was like, what is that? And the kid was probably about 20 pounds lighter than he had said he was going to be.
Oh.
And you could tell that, you know, you ask him to warm up and you put him in with one of your guys and stuff, and you could tell that you know, he's lacking a level. He might have the heart. He might have the heart that put him on a plane from Bogota to Costa Rica to actually go and get in a ring and fight, but he wasn't ready for it. So,
and he didn't know that.
I had to know, and it was obvious. And I pulled him aside and I told him, I don't think you're ready, but you came all the way over here, so I'm going to put you in against, you know, it's Costa Rica, and I'm going to put you in against a cocaine-dealing cab driver that sometimes dabbles in fighting. You know, that's more your level. Not these dudes with dirty fights that are coming from their country fucking here to try to get out of their country fighting, and having all of them had that theme of taking a step and flying and the whole thing. And this kid got slipped in and didn't make, you know, that first thing. You got to be on your toes, you know. If I let him get into the ring, at the very least, I've got one guy advancing in the tournament with an easy fight.
Yeah, you know, it reminds me of this time.
Fair, right? So, you know, not to mention.
You would ask me. But anyways, so back to Bellator. So that's a good segue into the next part about Bellator that I wanted to talk about, which is that on top of the technology they're using, another thing that I've noticed with Bellator that they've really been trying to push even harder lately is something that you had pushed early on, and you were kind of the first one to do this long before the UFC or anyone else really did it. I guess you could say Pride did it initially, but Pride didn't do it in the same way because Pride kind of did it in sacrifice of any American fighters. And you really used American fighters as 1/4 of the mix, and then 3/4 of the mix were global. And that was when you started to do the AFC. Maybe it started a little bit with hook and shoot, but then in the AFC you were really able to expand and start to bring in a global fighting class. And I think maybe that happened partially because of the connection with the ADCC. And then that obviously grew with MFC, Euphoria, and then on into Bodog. And now we're seeing Bellator really push hard to have a global experience in MMA like we haven't seen before. And, you know, there is no you have to speak English and you have to have your name that's pronounceable to all English-speaking peoples before we're going to put you on camera. That's no longer a given. You know, Joanna Jędrzejczyk was something that when she became champion, first of all, I'm a huge fan, but when she became champion, the one thing I said was, it's too bad that her name's not easier to pronounce, because it's going to be really hard to market her, because they don't have a good way to put a nickname on her that works and it's fast for Americans to learn so that they can market her. And they never really got a good market for her. And I don't know that she ever made any real money. And she seems to have kind of fallen by the wayside, unfortunately. I hope she makes that comeback. But having said that, Bellator seems to have thrown all that to the side and said, you know what, we don't care about it. We're marketing to more than America. We're marketing to the world. And that's the way we're going. And we're doing this with technology. So talk a little bit about that. Because you're the first. You're the expert on that.
Well, here's the deal. You can go into international, you know, fight promotion in a couple of different ways. And that's what I think bears questioning in the way Bellator is doing it, just asking the question. I mean, I'm not criticizing one way or another. But there's the UFC's way, where the UFC comes in and says, hey, you know, we're going to come here, we're going to lock down Moscow, we're going to do UFC Russia, and it's going to be our way with our people and this, that, and other stuff. And they give very little to the local promoters. In fact, they sometimes don't even need a local promoter. They need people on the ground, but not a true local promoter. It's the UFC promoting, and they come in. Whereas with Bellator, I think they have a nice product, and I'm wondering, and they definitely have ties to Russia. They've had a lot of Russians. Alexander Volkov, who just got knocked out in the UFC by Derek Lewis, was a long-time Bellator guy. So they've had Russian guys for a long time. But I think a lot of that has to do with can you cut a deal? If you can have access to that and you get on Russian TV, do you need Russian fighters on the roster? So why do you have so many Russians? It's because they're on Russian TV and they have to have 40% Russians. I don't know if that's the case, but there's always going to be an explanation. Another explanation for something like Italy, where they've done a lot of shows. With Italy, they're not even really presenting Bellator. Not Bellator MMA. They're presenting a mixed breed where they also bring in kickboxing because they do more of kickboxing over there and stuff. And the UFC would never do that. They present their brand completely different as an all-powerful, this is what we do, nothing else, and no one does it better. Whereas the other guys are like, yeah, we do kickboxing, we do this, So I think in that case, I'm not even sure if it's not even a WWE model. Well, the WWE just did a show in Saudi Arabia, and that's straight because Saudi Arabia said, here, take $50 million, and we want to see some matches. And they were like, fuck, with $50 million, we'll just get everybody on the roster over there, and everybody gets a great payday, and everybody has a nice payday and we do a huge show for basically a private audience.
Yeah, and again, I don't know anything about the professional wrestling, but the reports that I got were that was really bad. Is that what you got, or?
It breaks a lot of their models, right? Because what happens is this, they had WrestleMania, which for the last 30 years, they're like, they literally market WrestleMania this way. It's like, WrestleMania's here, and then, right below us, right there is the Super Bowl. Super Bowl's huge, and we're bigger. That's the way they deal with it. You've got your Super Bowl football. We are WrestleMania. So if you buy into the wrestling stuff, it's the biggest thing going, right? So how could they turn around and do rematches of all those fights 2 months later in Saudi Arabia because someone paid? So that's the problem with it. Some of the endings of WrestleMania may have been affected because they wanted to keep storylines open.
Sure.
To deliver a basic, like a funded show, a show where they didn't have to sell tickets, it was paid for, right? So now I don't know that that's what happens with Bellator in Italy, but there's got to be a deal there that Bellator monetizes, and that's why the focus on Italy. I'm not sure that there's great Italian MMA fighters, and that's why they're there. You know what I mean? In England, you could say that. In Russia, you could say that. Right now, Italy's not a hotbed. There have been fighters from, Alessio to other maybe lesser fighters from Italy, but I'm not saying that they haven't made some impact in MMA, but it's not a hotbed. But they're there because they maybe have a deal, and then they're also going to, we'll do kickboxing if that's what TV wants over there. The UFC doesn't do that.
Yeah, So okay, to kind of close things out then, just one more question for you about Bellator and we'll wrap it up because we're out of time here. So with Bellator, we've kind of touched quite a bit here over the last couple of weeks on Bellator, venturing out, trying to reach new audiences, trying to do new things with technology, taking risks. They've done the legends, and they brought in the geriatrics, if you will, and enough is enough of that, but apparently not, because they have, Chael's getting ready to fight Fedor, and they've still got Rampage in there. They've got Mitrione. I don't even know who Mitrione's supposed to fight. I don't follow it that closely because, it's pretty rough. It's pretty rough to watch. And I love those guys. Mitrione's from my hometown, and I've trained with the guy. And man, it's pretty rough to watch. Now, here's the truth. Mitrione could walk into the UFC right now in the condition that the UFC's heavyweight situation is. He's not going to fight DC and beat him. but he could be competitive in the heavyweight division right now in the UFC, and I sincerely believe that.
Well, he was. He was, and he left because of a contract, not because they, So I understand that. Mitrill's fighting Ryan Bader. Bader's the favorite to win the whole tournament. So you imagine a favor of Bader, a tournament final rather, of Bader and Fedor, right? Assuming Fedor beats Chael. And that's what's going on Bellator's tournament. I mean, that's decent. Yeah, here's the deal. It's a B-class tournament compared to what the UFC could do if the UFC really wanted to do tournaments, So it gets people's attention, and that's what Bellator does. But are they really competing with the UFC? Now, when it comes into competition, is guys like Mitrione, guys like Rory McDonald, and guys that are still have something to give and could compete in the UFC.
Yeah.
Why the UFC didn't sign them, and now is Bellator... is there something the UFC just didn't make him an offer, or is Bellator really a better offer for them? Are they competing with the UFC in that way? Because they seem to pick their spots. They're not going all out against, doing their roster. They're picking their spots, looking for certain guys. And, there's always reasons for certain guys to go over there, Mitrione at the end of the day wasn't going to break through into the UFC's upper echelon. He'd already done some of that stuff. And he was looking for bigger paydays. And they may have offered it to him. But they needed to fill their roster out to find fighters to fight Fedor. And at the end, they were running Fedor in with middleweights and light heavyweights. So that's what was going on there, is there was a need.
Yeah, what's Mitrione's payday on that?
Who?
What's Mitrione's payday on that?
I don't know. I don't know what Bellator has going on these days, but I imagine that it's competitive to what they're making with the UFC. Just keep in mind something as simple as this. Now that they're at Bellator, and they're on TV, right?
They're making money.
You can put a couple $100,000 worth of sponsors patches on their shirts and shit and walk out, just like the UFC used to walk out, like a mess with guys with back tattoos and stuff like that. But all that you can monetize. And at the end of the day, when the UFC got rid of all that, the argument, the reason that they didn't want to get rid of it is the fighters made more money in that structure.
Right.
So the UFC took a hit, but at the end of the day, so Bellator doesn't even have to come out of pocket to match the UFC's offer. They just say, yeah, you can, and you can have your own sponsors back.
Right.
And all of a sudden, at the end of a guy like Mitrione said, the UFC's going to, if they run me in there with, DC and, one or two of the other top guys, I'm not going to win the double paycheck, I'm 75 and 75 for a fight where I just go home with 75. Don't work for me anymore. What's Bellator got to offer? Oh, they'll give me X, plus I have all my own sponsors back, and I can do that. It adds up. Now all of a sudden the money's comparable, and that's competition.
Yeah, and just imagine this, and we'll close on this. Just as an audience and as a fight analyst, I just want everybody to think about this real quickly, and we'll close on this. Just think how much better that tournament would be if we would allow PEDs. How much better would that tournament be? How great would that be? It would look like we had 35-year-old men fighting instead of 45-year-old men. Instead of looking like they needed crutches and walkers to get out to the cage, they would run out to the cage and they would have big muscles and they would have what was left of a six-pack, and they would be able to fight for a round and 3/4 before they started to gas instead of 3/4 of the first round. And they would be able to hit super hard still and maybe take 2 shots before they fell down. And, they could wrestle a little bit and throw each other around the cage. Please, I'm begging you, everybody, let's get together. Let's get an opinion poll and let's say, let's bring PEDs back. Let's bring the old glory days of Pride back into MMA, and let's do something great for the world. Let's bring performance-enhancing drugs back into the sport of MMA for the love of all the fans who need it so badly. What do you say?
Hey, as long as it's happening, we're going to be here on the podcast. So what can I tell you? I don't know. I don't know if there aren't some things that aren't best left in history, like a lot of the old Pride stuff and things like that. I think that we've gotten to the point where, to refute some of the people out there, MMA is dead or anything like that. I mean, at the end of the day, from where we were to where we are now, I'm in a different part of the world, and I can turn on the channel and watch MMA fights on TV here, UFC fights on TV here every day. Every day it's reruns or the TV show or Latin versions of the TV show, commentators and things like that. It's on Fox Sports. The fights are still on pay-per-view and stuff. Yeah, they may not sell the 3 million pay-per-views that they sold, but they are a consistent product that's still out there. And MMA is, a sport. Now that it's there, it has its peaks and valleys. And, do you have peaks like boxing had with Mike Tyson, at some point, football did with, or has right now with Tom Brady, you know what I mean? But they all hinge on something special happening. And right now, a lot of the product looks the same and things, and it's hard to identify diamonds in the rough and what's coming up that's really special. And I think, that's what we're looking at it. But the thing's here to stay. It's international. It's worldwide. And like you got a champion from Russia. They're going to be able to monetize that. The thing about it is Nurmagomedov is the guy who stands to make a lot more money for the next fight than McGregor. McGregor will probably make the same he made for this one.
We'll have to see. Hey, we appreciate everybody coming. Chadillac at thecageragepodcast.com. Miguel at thecageragepodcast.com. Find us on Facebook, Chad Wagner, Miguel Iturrate on Facebook. You can find us at the Cage Rage Podcast on Facebook. You can find us at thecageragepodcast.com. This is on the Cage Rage Podcast on YouTube. We are working on getting this populated across the YouTube or across the podcast universe. That's a little bit tricky. We're finding out. We're trying to figure all of that out so everybody can find this on iTunes and all of it. You know where all that's at. So we're getting to it. We're getting better every day. We're figuring out as we go. Let us know what you think of everything. Okay, I haven't lost any weight yet, but I'm working on it. I still think I'm prettier than Miguel. Miguel argues that with me. He's probably got a pretty good argument. Kiss my ass. All right, so thank you for joining us. We will see you again. We've got a boxing podcast coming up pretty soon here. Namaste.